If you want to start taking pet portraits or gift them to family and friends, then I have the perfect tutorial for you. In this tutorial, we are going to use a basic set of pastel pencils. You don't need that many. They are all listed below for you. We're going to use a free reference photo from Andrea on Pexel. That is also linked below, so thank you to Andrea for that. And I'm going to take you through every single step with my best tips and tricks so that you can produce the best drawing possible, even as a beginner. It is totally possible. So let's dive in. To kickstart things, I'm going to go through the materials I'm using. If this doesn't apply to you, just skip ahead using the timestamps. So the paper I'm using is a sand-coloured Clairefontaine pastel mat. I'm actually working on a piece of board. It's a little bit thicker. Paper works just as well. This is just a bit of leftover board I had, and it was the right size for this tutorial. And then this stuff is fantastic. This is a crystal paper and it prevents you smudging your work. So you can lay it down, rest your hand over the top and draw away. And then when your work is finished, you can place this over your work to protect it until it is ready to be framed. Of course, you're going to need your selection of pastel pencils. I'll have all of these linked down below, but this is my beginner set, if you like. These are the pencils I would suggest to get if you're trying to start out as a wildlife or pet portrait artist with pastel pencils and you don't want to dive in and buy a full set because they're really expensive. You're going to need a putty rubber. You can see here, this is a brand new one. This is from Faber Castell. It'll need warming up a little bit. Really, really useful. Totally recommend getting yourself one of those. You're also going to need a craft knife, and you'll need some sanding paper and a bit of tissue and a box. And I'll show you what to do with this right now. So to begin, I'm going to show you how to sharpen your pastel pencils, which is of course really important. So be careful, but take your craft knife and take your pencil. Now, I am right-handed and I hold the knife in my right hand. You need to find something that is comfortable for you. What I do is the thumb of my left hand, so the hand that is not dominant for me, I press this into the back of the knife. Please make sure it's the back of the knife. And you can use this to dig into the pencil and run it along the length. If you go straight in, it's not going to work very well because instead you're effectively trying to saw through the pencil. So you want to run the blade along the length into the grain of the wood, and you can see that it chips away. Now, I am making this look fairly simple because you can imagine I've sharpened a fair few pencils in my time, but you're looking for something like this. So I'll quickly go through and do all of those. Now that we have all of our pencils sharpened to the first stage, we can sand them down. So if I take one here, all I'm going to do is hold it pretty low to the table. You want it low because it reduces the amount of strain on the pastel and you're less likely to snap it. If you hold it up high, you're probably going to snap it about there. So hold it low, and this one has already snapped, and you want to twizzle them around in circles. When you've done that, make sure that you wipe it off on a piece of kitchen towel, and you can see you end up with a beautifully pointy pencil to work with. So I'm going to quickly whiz through all of these. That's all of our pencils sharp and ready to go. So we're going to crack on straight away, starting with the eye. Now I'm going to start with 199. I have mine in a pencil extender here because it's a little bit short, and this is our black. You always want to start with the eye because the eye will set up your darkest darks and the lightest lights for your drawing, and it's going to make it much easier to balance the entire piece and get the right 3D form by the end. What I do is re-outline my eye so I'm happy, and then gently shade it in. I shade it in to start with because the black is very difficult to rub out. So by shading it in, I can check that I'm happy with the shape I'm creating before committing to it and pressing harder with the pencil. So once I'm happy, I'm going to press hard with the black and fill the eye in. You can see I'm leaving a gap here where the brightest reflection can be seen. Don't make the gap too big. The reflection doesn't need to be that large. You just need a small amount of card that is clean, and then you'll see what we'll do next. So once that is totally filled in, you can take your light grey, which is the 270 or the 230, depending on what you've got, and gently speck it into that area of clean card before going around with the pencil into the black. By going around into the black, I've made it softer and I've blended the two edges together. This makes the reflection feel like it's on the eyeball instead of being stuck onto the eyeball. The centre of that reflection is always going to be brighter because we left a bit of the card clean underneath. Now, we want to add a bit more depth to the eye. We can't really see a lot of the eye in the photo, but there is a nice little trick. Wherever you've got your brightest reflection, that white highlight, or grey in this case, go directly opposite. On the opposite side, you can add in a small catch light for the reflection. And this is for the iris. It's going to give your eye a lot of depth. It works like a treat every time. So if I've got a bad reference photo and I can't see a lot of what's going on in the eye, I know I can go directly opposite from that bright reflection and pop in a little bit of the iris. So you can see what I've done is I've pressed hard to begin with, or harder, and then I've gone over the top very gently with the pencil backwards and forwards, and just like our first highlight, I've blended it into the black, so it's all really, really soft. If yours doesn't look quite right, then check whether your edges are soft enough. If you're still struggling, take the black and ensure that all of the eye is properly filled in. And after that, check the size of your reflections. Have they become too big? If they have, draw over the top of part of them with the black. From there, we can take our dark brown, the 177 in this case, and I'm going to go around the eye. So you can think of this like eyeliner really. And I'm looking at the reference photo and bringing out some of the darker shapes. So we have the tear duct here, for example. Now, being that this is a beginner's tutorial, I'm going to be simplifying a lot of what we see here and not putting in all of the details. We want this to be not exactly a simple drawing. We want it to look good by the end, but we don't want to overwhelm with the amount of details that we've got there because they can actually become quite confusing to look at. Much better to simplify things to begin with. So once I've gone around the eye once with the brown, I'm going to go around again, but much more lightly this time, creating small circles with the pencil. Can you see that's making a nice fuzzy edge for me there? Now the reason that's really important is because I can blend that into my next layer. So the next layer is with the 283, and this is a reddish brown. Now if I didn't have the reddish brown, I could also use the 169, which is a purplish brown, a really nice colour that would actually work very well for this drawing. But again, I'm using a simple set of pencils for people who might have just got going with pastel pencils. Now, you can use the pencil on the side like this. What we're actually starting to do here is create the underpainting, and over this we're going to put our details. I like to use a pencil on the side for the underpainting because I get a very even and soft amount of pastel down, but it also prevents me putting in too many details too quickly and getting really tight in areas. So this is my darker pencil for parts of the underpainting. So look how I'm leaving little gaps. I keep looking at the reference photo, and those gaps are where we are going to go in with a slightly lighter tone. I'm not pressing crazy hard with this pencil. It's actually putting down quite a lot of pastel by itself fairly easily. But more than that, if we press too hard at this early stage, we're going to end up with the page totally oversaturated and we're not going to be able to get our details over the top. So what I'm going to do now is head around the entire drawing, picking out the dark areas for the underpainting with this pencil. And in some areas, I will probably use some darker pencils too, but I'll let you know when I get to those. And just before I actually shut up for a little bit and just draw, I'm following the fur direction while I do this. So make sure that you're happy with the fur direction. So up at the top of the ear in the photo, it's actually bare at the top of the ear, it's just skin. I'm just moving my pencil around in small circles there, so that I'm not ending up with lots of shading lines, directional lines, and just working it gently into the page. And then of course I'm going to give myself a nice soft edge. I'm lifting the pencil while I do this off the page. Keep that pencil moving and your marks will remain nice and fluid. So I would draw your attention to the area I'm working on now. If you have a look at the photograph and squint your eyes, you can see that there is a slightly darker section running along here, and that's picking out the separation between the upper and the lower jaw. So I'm just going to add a few more of these shading marks here. And when the details go over the top, those lighter hairs, we're still going to have a slight depression and it will give her a good amount of shape. So the shadow around the back of the dog under the neck, I'm going to use a different pencil for that because it's a lot cooler and quite a bit darker as well. But before I get there, I'm going to go in with this lovely pencil here, the 182. It's a beautiful golden brown colour. I use it a lot when I've got dogs that have a blondish tinge to their fur or even copper fur. It's really, really useful. I'm going to just head around the edges of the red-brown pencil that I've just put down. It's going to start to soften it a little bit and it will help it melt into the next bit of the underpainting, which is of course this bit. So we want to encourage these two pencils to gently blend together. If we end up with too many hard edges, which is where we've put two different colours or two different tones, tone just means light and dark, right next to each other, and we've not bothered to blend them together at all, then in general you end up with something that feels quite fragmented by the end and not actually particularly 3D. So I would really encourage you to have a bit of a play with blending, and when it comes to drawing, see that your first few projects are more of an experiment. It's a learning process as opposed to trying to produce something beautifully finished. I often find that people who are starting out can quite easily put a little bit too much pressure on themselves. Don't expect it to be perfect at all. Just enjoy the process. And every time you do something that you think, I don't think I'd do that again, just make a little note of it. And every time you do something that you're quite happy with, have a think about how that happened. And effectively, you are actively learning while you're drawing. And that is all I do. I'm just constantly thinking about different ways I could do something. I love watching other people on YouTube often as well, and seeing how they draw, seeing how they can use their materials in a different way to me, and how I might be able to bring that into my own work. So you can see I'm still following the fur direction as I work. I'm using the pencil on the side still because it gives me that really beautiful flat edge. And don't worry if you're a beginner and you find holding your pencil like this a little bit awkward. You can hold it however is most comfortable to you. You might like your pencil to be a little bit more blunt if you need to hold it like a pen for this stage, because otherwise you're going to be putting down tiny fine markings, which is much more how we're going to be working when we put the details over the top. So before I carry on, I'm just going to make a few areas a bit darker. I'm picking up the 177, which is that beautiful dark brown we had at the beginning. I'm going to work on the eye socket structure just a little bit more. I've got the brow coming over the top here that needs to be a bit darker. And likewise at this side, we need a little bit more of a shadow. Now, it's quite nice to add this at this stage because there is already some pastel down, there's extra on the page, and they're going to mix together. So this doesn't come out too harsh, it doesn't come out too dark, and it means that the amount of blending we need to do to make everything sit together harmoniously is massively reduced. Be very, very light with this pencil as you work around the drawing. It is quite dark. So I'm just picking out some of the shadows that can happily go a little bit darker. And you'll see in a moment that we can work backwards and forwards between all of these pencils so that they blend together nicely. Again, think about how the different colours are mixing together. This is a soft creature, it's got soft fur, so we don't want loads and loads of hard, solid edges because it won't look right. We'll get the wrong texture if we do that. So while I have this pencil out, I'm also going to start to work into the neck. So we're not going to do too much of the neck. We're going to focus mostly on the face because it will give us a really good opportunity to practice all of the fur. But of course, if you want to get into pet portraits, you can't just draw a floating head. You're going to need a neck with that. So again, if you can, use your pencil on the side and start to bring this pastel down the neck. Now look at the direction that I'm moving my pencil in. It's going in roughly the same direction as the fur, but it's also helping to create that curved shape that we need for the neck. So it's a little bit darker under the ear. The back of the neck is catching some reflected light, so it's going to be a little bit lighter. Let's not put as much of that down at the back of the neck yet. And then we come underneath the ear and the jaw. Now, if you have a look at the reference photo, the edge between the ear and the neck is really soft, which simply means that they are blended together, and it's very difficult to see where one starts and the other finishes. So I'm just going to move my pencil, I'm sweeping it on and off the page and start to blend them into each other. There'll be a few detailed wisps that come out over the top of these shadows, but they will go on at a later stage. Let's bring this darker shadow up the side of the ear. We've got those really lovely curls around the edge of the ear here. Again, I'm still lifting my pencil on and off the page. You can see that if we went in too heavy with that first layer of pastel, we'd have loads and loads of pastel on the page now, which wouldn't be right. I like to have my pet portraits quite often simply fade away out of the page. I can show you when we actually finish the pet portrait a nice little trick to help that happen. But for now, I'm just going to make sure that this bottom edge is nice and soft, and I tend to bring the front edge down a bit further, and it gives it the classic proportions and classic balances of a bust. So working back in with the 283, which is the reddish brown, I can now head back over the top of some of the areas which have the dark brown on. So building up the underpainting really is a layering process. I like to work in light layers, generally speaking, or at the very least for fur like this. I find working in light layers to be particularly good because we get lots of soft edges, and it's much easier to end up with natural looking curls as opposed to really stiff, rigid curls, which are quite difficult to work with to make them look natural. So you can see the more I add, the more solid the portrait begins to feel. So in this beginner set, I've also got a pencil that looks very similar to the 182, which is the golden brown I was using before, but it's the 180, so make sure you're picking up the right pencil. The 180 hasn't got quite as much pigment, which is just as much colour in it. Instead of being golden brown, this is a neutral brown, and I'm going to use that on the neck because there is less colour on the neck. Tonally, which means light and dark, this pencil is very, very similar to the 182. So you can see I'm bringing it gently over the top of some of the areas of that dark brown, just where it's starting to get a little bit lighter. Still using the pencil on the side if you can. So you might be able to see on camera, and you might not, there is actually a line running down the centre of my portrait. As I said, this is just an old piece of pastel board that I had, and it's clearly got a crease running down the centre. So that's just where the pastel hasn't gone into it very well, which is of course why you need to keep your materials safe. But this is a piece of scrap, so I'm going to let myself off on that one. So the underpainting is pretty much there for starters. It's very simple for this piece. So the next phase to do is the nose. Now, noses can often be quite tricky for dogs. I actually have a full class on dog noses, particularly if you want to do them in a straight on or 3/4 pose, because it's actually easiest to think about them like a box. But for this one, we have the nose in profile, which means we've got less work to do. So I'm just going to pick out the nose, just like I did with the eye, re-outlining it, getting myself familiar with that shape, and checking that I'm happy with the shape that I can see. So I like to begin with the darker areas, just like we did for the eye. I'm going to pick up the black, and like we did with the eye, carefully go in to start with. And just find that curve on the front. There's a nice little curve shape here that shows us it's the edge of the nostril. Dark comes all the way down the front of the nose. The nostril opens up a little bit on the side. And then just as we did with the eye, when I'm happy, I'm just going to go in and press a bit harder into the areas where it needs to show up more. Very similar to the eye again, I'm going to take the dark brown, the 177, and work into those areas which are a little bit lighter than the black. So we've got some on the bottom of the nose. Now you can see I've just put a line in there for now, but this doesn't join it into our underpainting. So what you want to do is head along with the pencil, either on the side or just very softly on the tip, and lift it off the page into the underpainting, and then we get a beautiful transition there. I have made that look a little bit easy. If you're just starting out, don't worry if things like transitions take a bit of time to get used to. Going to lightly shade in the bottom of the nose, just lightly. And I'm also going to shade in this little area inside the nostril. Keep looking at the reference photo, and I'm going to head around the edges of the black now, just lightly. That's going to help us blend into the next layer and make it all sit together nicely. Now, right on the top of the nose, there's another opportunity for a little bit of blending. Lift that pencil backwards over the edge and into the fur. Pop the brown down because that is very dark, and go in with the 283, which is of course nice and red. Now if I had a full set, I'd probably once again use some of the 169 in here because it is a bit more purple than this, but that's absolutely fine. We can still make this work with the 283 instead. Now I glazed over this bottom section that I'm working on with the brown, and by going over the top with the 283 now, it's just going to make this pencil a little bit darker than it would have been ordinarily. I'm moving the pencil in small circles as I work, and that's helping to mix everything together for me on the page. I've left the top of the nose a little bit lighter in terms of not completely filling it in with this pencil. That's going to allow me a little bit of space to get in a few other markings instead. So I'm actually bringing in a new pencil to begin with, the 273. This is a mid-grey and it's a really useful pencil. I'm going to use this for the area where we can see some gentle blue reflections on the top of the nose. Obviously, we haven't got a blue in this set, but a grey will work just as well. I'm being super light as I head over the top, and I'm allowing this to scumble with the pencil underneath, which means that we're going to create an effect somewhere between the two pencils, as there are pockets of each tone and each colour showing through by themselves. So I'm just working my way around here, nice and gently. Build it up slowly. Then we can pick up the pink, which is probably one you were expecting me to pick up for this. Again, don't press too hard. The pink is very light. We don't want to make the nose too bright. So mainly putting that towards the back. And let's go in with the highlights, and then we can make our little adjustments. So there's a really bright reflection on the front of the nose coming down. And then there are some softer reflections. So I'm working my pencil in small circles and I'm not pressing very hard. This is mixing it into the other pastel that is already down. If we don't mix it in gently, then again, just as I was saying with the reflection in the eye, it's going to look like something's been stuck onto the nose. So make sure that you're happily blending everything together. A little bit on the top. A little bit more pink down here maybe. Yes. I'm going to leave the nose there for now and carry on with the next step, partly because you can overwork something quite easily, especially when the rest of the portrait isn't yet finished, and you can be intent upon perfection in a part of the drawing, and actually when the drawing's finished you realise there was nothing wrong with it in the first place, but you could have overworked that area. It's a very small space to be putting pastel into. The more pastel that we put down into one tiny area, the more it's going to mix. So I would say as a beginner, do a pass in the area, and even if you're not happy with it, pop your pencils down and just move on to the next bit, because otherwise you can end up in this horrible situation where you've got too much pastel down and then really you're just making pastel soup. So let's start on the fur. I'm going to make a start with not the ivory, but a pink. I love putting a little bit of pink into dogs with blonde and ginger fur. It works so well because of course pink is red with white added into it. And the colours that we have going on in here are yellows and oranges and reds. So it makes sense to use pink because pink is a red. They're all harmonious colours and they sit next to each other on the colour wheel. So I'm not going to go mad with this pencil, of course, because the dog isn't pink, but it's just going to help the lighter hairs have a little bit more lift to them, prevent them being quite as flat, especially as we're going to be using pretty much one pencil for most of the fur over the top. Adds a little bit of warmth too. And it can also really help with some transitions from parts of the underpainting out into what is going to be the ivory. My top tip for drawing fur, and fur is potentially the hardest part of a pet portrait, especially for beginners, is to just make sure that your pencil is already moving before it hits the page. If you end up just making stagnant marks on the page, the marks become quite thick to start with, and they can also start to look very heavy and wooden. So I like to move my pencil. You can see I'm moving it quite quickly. Again, that comes with practice, so don't beat yourself up, but I move it quite quickly and sweep it on and off the page. Now I'm not going to bring the fur right up to the edge of the eye because it's quite dark right next to the eye. But I have these markings and I can see where they start because the underpainting is a bit darker and we don't want that. So what we're going to do is just tap and it will gently smudge in just the beginning of each stroke. We don't want to do it across the entire length of that hair because then you're just going to blend all of the hair out. So just tap where the markings are appearing from and they can gently blend in. So new for 2024, I've got some pet portrait classes that are coming out online. Some of them will be on YouTube, of course. I'll be putting out little snippets on YouTube for you guys, but I'm going to have a full masterclass coming out on my website. So this is going to be a really deep dive into pet portraits. I'm going to be going through lots of different breeds of dogs. Some dogs are harder than others. I'm going to be going through loads of different fur techniques. I'm going to be going through eyes and noses from different angles, but also if you want to become a pet portrait artist, I'm going to be talking about how to find clients, but also how to deal with bad reference photos. So the whole course will be coming out next year, 2024, depends when you're watching this video. It might already be live. There will be a link below when it is live, and there is also a sign-up sheet at the moment, so you can be the first person to find out about it because there will be something special happening for the first people to enrol on this new course for 2024. So I'm going to add quite a bit of pink around the nose. I can see a lot of lovely warmth around there. You might be thinking this is looking really strange at the moment with the amount of pink, but bear with me. So I'm now going to start to work with some pencils that we've already used to add in the same colours and tones but as details this time. So I'm starting with the 182, which is one of my favourite pencils, to be honest, that lovely golden brown. And I'm gently adding in some more hairs, and these are weaving themselves in and around some of the pink. Now, what you must be careful of here is that you are moving the pencil swiftly and your markings are nice and fine. If your markings start to become too thick, you will find that all of your work begins to blend together for you. So if you're struggling with your work blending together, it just means you've got a bit too much pastel down. It does take a couple of drawings for you to start to get a rhythm and start to understand exactly how much pastel for each stage is a good amount. It's sort of like baking a cake, really. Someone can tell you how to do it and show you how to do it, but until you've done it yourself and until you've burnt it a few times, you're not really going to fully understand the process. So definitely just look at these drawings as practice, and don't worry if they don't come out exactly how you want it to. Still giving it a go. You can see that this is building up a beautiful texture for me. I'm also pulling my pencil back on itself quite a bit instead of holding it face down, and that helps to keep it nice and sharp. So there's plenty of gold in the ear, we definitely want to get quite a few of these beautiful strands into there. It's a little bit of a tricky fur direction inside this edge of the ear. So again, if you've not got it right, don't worry about it too much. Just give it a go. And then I'm going to work around some areas in the face. There isn't as much of this, I don't think, to add in the main area of the face. It's much more just ivory in there. And then, surprise, surprise, we're also going to go in with the 283, which is that reddish brown, and we're going to do the same. So we won't need quite as much of this because this is very dark, but once again, a little bit around the eye doesn't hurt. So I'll pop a little bit here and there where I can see some darker areas. Markings I'm making with this pencil are smaller because I don't want the effect to be overwhelming, you could say. This is overall a blonde dog, so we don't want to add too many dark tones in and start to change the colour of the fur. But there are some shadows, mainly running along the edge of this snout where the fur is all kinking up in different directions. Again, bit of a tricky area to get right. The fur is crisscrossing around. I would take time just to have a look at your reference photo and really study how the fur is moving around there. Don't try and get it absolutely perfect because you can't. It's really confusing to see what's going on. This is coming together beautifully. Part of the reason is because we're working on the sand pastel mat, and that sand colour is working really well because obviously it's harmonious with the other colours that we have in the fur. So picking the right colour of pastel mat does help you out pretty enormously in some cases. Sometimes I purposefully actually go for a contrasting colour, but for beginners I would use the sand most of the time, I'd say. So as a final layer for this sort of middle section, you could call it, before we go in with the highlights, I'm going in with the 187 because it's another pencil that I have in this beginner's set that will add a little bit more warmth, so it's going to fill out the form a little bit more. Again, if I had my full set of pencils, I would be using different pencils at this stage, but hopefully this allows you to see that you can create great pieces of art without having, in inverted commas, the right materials or the perfect materials. Whatever you've got, you can make work. So I'm just looking for areas where I can see a little bit more of the gold, and the orange is just going to help pick them out because it's a bit lighter than the 182. But having that 182 golden brown in those areas and underneath is going to prevent this becoming just too orange instead. So again, this beautiful curve coming around the ear. That's going to benefit from a nice little bit of the orange. Make sure your pencil is nice and sharp when you're doing fur work, especially for areas like this where we've got loads of individual but long strands, because we don't want them mixing together too much on the page. Just going to use my pencil ever so slightly on the edge up here. I'm going to lighten and warm up that shadow a little bit. Okay, let's start on our lighter tones. Now this is going to depend a little bit on what you've got. I'm using an Ivory. This is a different brand. It doesn't matter. It's just what I've got. The Ivory from Faber Castell is the 103. If you've got something like the 102, which is a lemon, it's a close cousin, but it's a bit more yellow, then you're going to want to mix that with something like the light grey, the 270, because the lemon is going to be a bit too yellow by itself. So use the lemon and a light grey together in that instance. But if you have an Ivory, which in the Faber Castell set is the 103. This is a Carbothello ivory, just because I had one to hand that was nearly sharpened. Then you can go ahead and we can start to pick out the beautiful details on top. Now, this is where the fur markings are going to show up the most. So you've already had a nice little bit of practice before this point, which is absolutely great. Things to consider as you work are such things as the fur is in little clumps, as you can see on the reference photo. So instead of just doing lots of individual strands, try working on strands that start from a different place and end together roughly, and we can start to create the texture that we can see in the photograph. So I'm creating these strands and they run down together. Now, just like we did around the eye, if where the strand is originating from is a bit too prominent on the page, you can just gently tap back on those markings and it blends the pastel into the rest of the work really, really well. It's a great little trick. Now be sure to make sure, that made no sense, be sure to leave some of the underpainting showing through in the gaps. Again, you can see in the reference photo, there are plenty of shadows between all of these strands. So if you filled up the entirety of your page, you're going to make it flat. We create dimension by creating differences, often in tone, which is light and dark, between two things. So we must make sure that we allow little gaps, and that's also going to allow us to create definition in all of the strands. I'm lifting my pencil on and off the page, sweeping it on and off the page. It's constantly moving so that I'm not ending up with those heavy stagnant marks. Again, this is something that takes a little bit of time, so if you're struggling with it, really don't worry about it. Just keep trying. Honestly, over time it does come. It's that pencil dexterity, to be honest. You're using a hand in a very different way to that which we would normally. We're often tapping on our phones or clicking on a keyboard. They're very different movements. So don't expect yourself to pick up a pencil and if you haven't drawn for a while, just be able to get on with it in 5 seconds, because it can feel almost a little bit like you're using the wrong hand to draw with. And you look at your hand and you think, well, why can't I make those markings happen? I'm making it look easy. So keep practicing, keep sweeping the pencil on and off the page. And then when markings show up a little bit too blunt and you can really tell where they've come from and slapped onto the page, just tap them back with your finger. So you can see I'm leaving quite a few gaps before the lighter hairs are showing up. And all I'm going to do is just run my finger up to the start of these light markings, and then we can create that shadow into light effect that we can see on the reference photo. So don't start with your pencil down here, you want to start with it towards the end of the underpainting. So as we come towards the front of the nose here, the lighter fur becomes thicker. So we want to make sure that we are leaving fewer gaps around this area because there is more of that light fur. And don't worry for all of the darker areas that you can see with the, I think, wet fur, to be honest, dripping down below, because we can add those in later. Let's get all the light stuff in to begin with. Again, I'm still very much thinking about clumping everything together while I work. And this is really helping to create the right texture. And it's also helping with the dimension and the form of the dog to give it a nice 3D presence on my page. As you go through, you probably will need to just stop and sharpen your pencil. I probably should, to be honest. I'm a very lazy drawer, do as I say, not as I do. And for this section here, where we're catching quite a lot of light, but it's out of focus because it's further away from the camera lens, I use my pencil on the side again and create a block, a shading block of the tone instead. And then as we come further down the nose, we can see that it gets a bit darker. So I'm going to glaze over the top of the other pastel colours that I've already got down, but lightly, so that they mix together for me instead. For this lovely shape on the ear, if we have a look at the reference photo, the light is coming from over here, so the back of the curl is not catching this bright light. So what I'm going to do is add some shorter markings to begin with, coming down this coil of fur. And then once I've done that, again, I'm just going to lightly take my finger and encourage the ends to blend in so it looks like one piece of fur there. And I can carry on back into the ear. When it comes towards the back of the drawing, we're going to mix the grey in with this ivory because the light down there is cooler than at the front. So the grey, in contrast with this warm ivory pencil, is going to look slightly blue and give us that nice cool effect. Of course, if you're using something like the lemon, the 102, then you might just want to put that down entirely and just use your grey. So let's start to work on that fun fur on top of the head now. So similar to this section that I did down there, I'm going to start actually with my pencil just lightly on the side. This is a little bit more out of focus. I'm kind of thinking about drawing fur, but just with this fat side of the pencil, so I'm unable to draw it really accurately. So you can see I've swept it in and out of the edges of the underpainting. I can now go in and use it to add a couple of extra bits of detail, but without going too overboard. Need to fill in the top of the head here. There's a little bit more fur to go in. And then as I get towards the back of the head, as I said, we're going to need some of the grey. So I've got the 270, you might have the 230 or another light grey, it really doesn't matter. And let's go in and start to add some of this slightly cooler, light toned pencil. So I'm working it into the back of the ear as well, because we have the same effect happening there. And you'll find that this weaves into your ivory really beautifully, tonally, so light and dark, they're the same lightness. They're the same tone, but they have a different temperature. They have a different pigment in them. And this is going to look ever so slightly blue when it's placed next to that lovely ivory pencil. You can see I'm just drifting the pencil off the page, and by moving it while I'm lifting it off the page, I'm getting those lovely realistic looking fur marks on the drawing. So that again comes with a little bit of confidence, just to know that you can continue to move your pencil quite swiftly and lift it off out into the area of open card, which can feel a little bit scary when you're beginning, but it works so well to give you a beautiful soft finish. I'm going to bring the grey into some of the markings up here as well. They're sticking right up and catching a little bit of the cool light as well as the warm light. So that's the face almost done. Being that this is a beginner's tutorial, I'm not going completely overboard with this because it's quite easy to overwork it. So I'm going to work into a couple of areas again, and then we'll finish off the neck and he's done. So I'm going to take the black to begin with. Just want to make my eye a slightly different shape. And I'm going to work around the edge of the eye like we did with that dark brown, really lightly so that it nestles in a little bit more. For me, it was sticking out slightly too much. And then I can bring my light ivory markings a bit closer over the top. And as a nice final flourish for the eye, I can take my pink and pick out a little bit of the eyelid. So leave a nice little gap between the eye and where you're going to put these markings to give that a nice good depth. I have a couple of areas where the card for me is showing through just a little bit too much. I pick up some of my slightly darker pencils to begin with. So this is the 283, and I'm not pressing too hard. I'm just working around and in between some of the lighter tones that I've already put down, some of those ivories and oranges and all sorts went into there, and just adding a little bit more. And then I'm going to pick up my pink, basically a little repetition of the first round of steps. Just add a little bit more pastel into those areas. Now, as I said, we can see some, I think they're probably wet pieces of fur, which are much darker right at the bottom. I'm going to start with the 182 because it's not too dark. And I'm just going to run this, starting inside the area of ivory and allowing my pencil again to come off the page just to give me a couple of slightly darker marks right at the bottom. You want to make sure that your pencil is sharp enough that you're going to get a fairly fine marking. You don't want this really, really thick. If you feel like your pencil work isn't quite up to this yet, then you can just leave this out. Nobody's going to know. I often say to people, and it is so true, you don't hang your work next to the reference photo. So to help those blend in, you might just need to, like me, take the ivory and over the top of where some of those markings are, we can just blend it gently in and they disappear. We're just ending up with a few nice details at the bottom of the chin, which does help just to finish off the portrait. And then I'm going to take the 180, again, make sure it's the 180 and not the 182, and just fill in the tooth of the card a little bit more now, which simply means adding a bit more pastel. And blend the two browns together. So you'll already have a dark brown down. If you've already got a fair amount of pastel down on that bit, you might not need to add a bit more. I didn't have loads down, so blending the two bits of pastel into each other was going to be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to take the putty rubber, just clean up around the edge of the neck. Use it just to drag down. This gives me a nice soft end. And then pick up that mid-grey. We used it a little while back, the 273 or the 233. And again, use it on the side. We can begin to just add some of the cooler light down the back of the neck. I really would try and use the pencil on the side for this bit. It's going to prevent you adding details. And then take the light grey very carefully. We don't need to add this quite as widely. So very carefully with the light grey, we can just add a little bit right down the edge of the back of the neck. Not too much. Blend those areas together. And then for the front, where it gets warmer, just add some of my warmer tones in. So this is the 182, so that's the golden brown. Again, blend that out. Can add a little bit of my orange. Not too much of any of these. And I think a little bit of the pink right towards the bottom. Because it's so light, it's just going to help all of this gently fade out. Take my finger, blend everything together, and as a final flourish, you might want to sharpen it up. You can just add a few more of those marks over the top of the neck, coming off the bottom of the ear. That pushes the ear forward in the picture, so it comes over the neck, which is great, but it also draws the attention back up to the areas of detail and away from the neck, which we're going to keep very simple for this beginner's pet portrait tutorial. You can just see a couple of extra markings that I can't quite resist. This is my dark brown, the 177. So, final touch, and I would advise you do this on every pet portrait because of course you're going to go on to become a pet portrait artist after this. I'm sure this has inspired you. I hope it has, because honestly, pet portraits are a great thing to be able to do for gifts, but also honestly, people will commission you. You'd be amazed the amount of people that I've taught, and then they end up taking commissions. So it's really a great little hobby to have, especially if you enjoy it, because you can start to charge for some of your work too. So final touch is to go back in with a black. I would do this at the end of any pet portrait. And just go back into the centre of the eye. It picks up dust from the rest of the portrait, and it won't actually be black by the end. And likewise, although we haven't made this reflection white, I'd go back in and just pop a tiny speck inside the reflection in the eye, or if there's another area of the drawing that has a really bright reflection, go and re-establish it down there. Don't forget, all the materials are listed below for you, and if you have any questions, then do leave them in the comments. You can find full-length tutorials on my channel and even more good stuff over on my website as well. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy drawing.